Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I do want to say before we get started that we regret the conflict tonight with Yom Kippur, and we want to wish our colleagues and friends a happy and peaceful New Year. We believe in the importance of everybody being able to take part in this conversation. So to that end, we are video recording the event, and it will be available on our YouTube channel and our website soon. So just wanted to make that mention. All right. This event is hosted by the Center for the Study of Social Difference, and we couldn't do it without our co-sponsors. I want to give a thank you to the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Barnard Center for Research on Women, the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia. And I also want to thank all of our graduate assistants and coordinators that make the work of the center possible. Tonight in particular, I want to thank our student assistants. That's Stephanie Choi, Stephanie Sanchez, Kelly Wan, Marianne Padron, and an extra special thank you to our program coordinator, Aya El-Dasugi. It would not be possible, any of this. We'd be lost without you, Aya, at the center. So I just want to give you a round of applause. My name is Catherine Lasota. I'm the executive director at the Center for the Study of Social Difference. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I want to leave as much time as possible for these wonderful panelists and a discussion in the room. I do want to bring your attention to the fact that 3 of our panelists are contributors to this book, Indelible and the Hippocampus, Writings from the Me Too Movement, and it's available for sale outside from Astoria Bookshop. It's terrific. It's a great read. I encourage you to get a copy, get a gift for a friend. That's my plug for the book, which is amazing. And also thank you today for coming here today. It's just a few days past the 1-year anniversary of Christine Blasey Ford's powerful testimony. This event, as I mentioned, was organized by the Center for the Study of Social Difference and our Women Creating Change initiative. This is a research center at Columbia. It's home for faculty across all of our schools who are working on similar issues, asking the hard questions about how their research relates to gender, race, class, sexuality, and difference. Part of our mission is to foster conditions for women and scholars around the globe to have space to work and think together to create change in their communities. Last year, Women Creating Change celebrated its 5-year anniversary, and the center its 10-year anniversary. And our celebrations took place on September 27 and 28, 2018, right when Christine Blasey Ford was giving her testimony. And I'm giving this for some context because as we were gathered having our conversations at our anniversary symposium, which was called What We Can Do When There's Nothing to Be Done, Strategies for Change, and we were considering the theme of our symposium, we felt compelled to respond to the events taking place with the Kavanaugh hearings. We ended up creating a statement together as a group with hundreds of conference attendees and panelists alike, and we took this photo, which is going to be a little difficult for everybody to see, but it's the cover of our current annual report. A lot of people stood up for this photo. Some of you in the room were in this photo, and we signed off on a statement together that I just want to share a couple of sentences from. We said, we, several hundred students, teachers, writers, artists, activists, scholars, community members, privileged and disempowered alike, gathered together today to think, reflect, and act on the theme of what we can do when there's nothing to be done. We spent the day together critically thinking about what we can do to advance social justice through various forms of intellectual work, artistic creation, political action, and modes of protest. All the while, we have felt outraged at the political developments in this country just outside these walls. We did also sign off on 5 principles together, and I'm just going to read those 5 principles of what we can do. 1, we can do something, even when there seems to be nothing to be done. 2, if capable, we can and should utilize our privilege and the space we occupy to facilitate resistance, even in the face of presumed hopelessness or pessimism. 3, we acknowledge the power of small gestures to lead to acts, to lead to movements. 4, we will resist temptation to return things to normal. 5, to change the world, we must also be changed. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to leave it there from our center. Just before I do, a quick note, if you do enjoy the programming this evening, we are having, on October 23rd, Columbia Giving Day. If you donate to Women Creating Change, it's going to help us have more events like this. We have information in the lobby if you're interested and able or so inclined. I'm going to introduce our moderator, and she will introduce our panelists in turn. Our moderator, Davia Temin, is CEO of Temin Co, a boutique management consultancy that helps organizations create, enhance, and save their reputations, and she coaches board directors and C-suite executives. Temin Co has also developed the Temin Index, the largest known inventory of Me Too accusations since Bill Cosby, to glean trends and key statistics from the movement in order to advise boards and executive leadership on the most discreet and impactful ways of addressing the issue honorably. And that is very important, I know. She's an honors graduate of Swarthmore College. She served on their board and numerous other boards and advisory boards, including as the chair of Video Volunteers, ProPublica, Harvard Women's Leadership Board, Women Corporate Directors, and Girl Scouts of Greater New York. She's profiled in many business and leadership books. She also writes the Reputation Matters column for Forbes.com. In 2015, Davia was honored by the Girl Scouts of New York at their gala annual dinner and presented with their highest award, the Pinnacle Award for Leadership, honoring her work as a business leader and role model for girls and women within business and the greater communities. In 2017, she was honored by the National Organization for Women, accepting their Women of Power and Influence Award for her extensive achievement advancing women's leadership in business, government, and society through a broad array of professional and nonprofit work, both in the US and around the world. We're very honored to have Davia here moderating this panel. Please give a warm welcome.
Believe me, it sounds better than it really is. I am so pleased to be with you here tonight, and I know that we all are. I think this is an amazing anniversary that we have here. The first anniversary of Blasey Ford's testimony, the second anniversary of Harvey Weinstein's outing in the New York Times, and the approximate origination of the Me Too movement. So what are our goals for this panel? Well, to put them in the language of hashtags, why now, Me Too? What's next? After all, stories of egregious, horrific, horrendous, or even mundane sexual harassment, abuse, and rape have punctuated our world seemingly since it began. From the days of the cavemen grabbing women at the mouth of the cave, by the hair, right up to present day. It is estimated that 80% of women on the planet have experienced some form of sexual harassment. And I would say that that is probably a conservative estimate. And we'll, I'm sure, hopefully all weigh in on that. Their stories, sometimes captured in narrative, sometimes captured in fiction, sometimes, albeit rarely, captured by the police, courts, or the EEOC, happen relentlessly in the workplace, at home, on street corners, and in social situations. They happen in places where nobody sees, and they happen in places where everybody sees. And it's been going on forever. Yet now that Me Too has started, even though its progress is inconsistent, it's beginning to feel unstoppable. And if you talk about those 5 precepts that Catherine was talking about, and you talk about the reason I suspect that all of us are here, it is to give that unstoppability, that momentum to this movement, no matter what kinds of perturbations it goes through. Stories and reports are coming out from every workplace, from all kinds of relationships, victimizing women, men, straight, gay, trans, you name it. No one seems to have a corner on abuse. It's equal opportunity. In fact, the research, as Catherine was talking about, that my firm does on this Me Too index, all of the high-profile accusations that have happened since Cosby, that have happened since Weinstein, and happened since last year, and each of those stories has to have been reported in 7 major media outlets. So it's pretty high profile. We now are butting up to 1,500 accusations, which is huge. And it is, we all know, a tip of the iceberg of what really goes on everywhere else. So, all these stories, first person, observed, fiction, nonfiction, are captured in Shelly Oria's new book that she has edited, Indelible in the Hippocampus. And of course, as you know, the quote from that that Christine Blasey Ford said was, "Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense." So, but why now? And I just want to go into a little bit because it's important, I think, and it's a confluence of a lot of different factors that at this special moment in the world have come together. One, social media, that allows one person to speak, often anonymously, to the world, so that other people hear those stories, and then when they hear them, anonymously or not, they sort of sound familiar, and then they realize that the same thing happened to them, and often from the same aggressor. And then they post their story, and sometimes it's anonymous also. And then more come and more happen, because these things are a little bit like cockroaches. They do not come singly, usually. And then more people come, and then one person makes the transit and actually posts their name on it. And then other people do, and then that starts a movement that can go almost anywhere. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. So that's number one. Number two, the growing number of women in the workplace for the last decades who have been set free by birth control so that they can flood into the workplace and then experience the inequities that happen just because of gender and conscious, unconscious, or subconscious bias. These women have been penting up their anger, and now it is breaking through, validated by others who share their concerns. Three, compounded by this and epitomized by a number of you, there are more women in positions of power and control. And they actually listen to other women's stories and believe them, not dismiss them. These are women journalists, editors, C-suite executives, college presidents, and board members who actually take it seriously, along with the men of good conscience who have always been there, but now may feel freer to object to objectionable behavior. 4, a high-profile villain, an ugly man inside and out, who victimized almost every woman he came in contact with. And many of those happen to be bold-faced names who finally, individually and as a group, banded together to tell their stories of Harvey Weinstein's appalling act. To the New York Times, to the New Yorker, and to the world. And we know that bold-faced names cut through the news fog. Whether you like it, whether you don't, whether you think it's salutary, whether you don't, people look at celebrity, and celebrity is powerful. Attention is paid. So Rose McGowan, Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow captured the headlines unlike other victims ever have been able to do, and legitimized everyone else in the doing. After all, people thought, if it could happen to them, I guess I can admit it's happened to me. And finally, I believe that there's an undeniable factor that's also comes from having our president, who himself has been accused as a serial sexual harasser and abuser, and that has enabled what one might call a rape culture at the top of the House or Supreme Court. Though our country still saw fit to elect him, those Access Hollywood tapes also have remained with us. And though we couldn't seem to call him to account, in some ways, Weinstein has almost become his proxy as the collective disdain and hatred of the ages rain down upon him. And with that, on other male aggressors. So this is a toxic, maybe salutary mix of stuff that has begun to disgorge more and more secrets. 1 year, 2 years, an eternity, we're still trying to make sense of that. And that's why we're here today. What we're here to do is to look at this book that is a brilliant compilation of narrative, fiction, poetry, to make sense of where we are today and where we might be going tomorrow. And really, I hope that we're going to have a good conversation all on the panel and then with you guys on it. Because my hope for this forum is that with the amazing people on the stage and in the audience, we can take a moment to go beyond polemics and beyond the surface and take a deep dive into what is happening, how it is happening, why it is different today, and where we go next. So on a personal note, I actually feel like a lot of this is exactly where I'm meant to be because I started off as a rape counselor at Columbia and at the Women's Counseling Project, which is was started off at Union Theological Seminary and then at Earl Hall and then at Barnard, and then became chair of the board of that thing a long time ago in the late 70s. And so in all the work that I do working with women in coaching and in reputation and all of it, this stuff comes up. And the men and women at the top of the house that I work with want to know what they can do to make it stop in their organizations. And I think we all sort of want to talk about how to make it stop in all organizations. So, sexual harassment is not limited to one industry or cohort, nationality. It's truly, if you will, intersectional. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how we can change it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce each person sequentially. Then they're going to talk for about 5 minutes about something that around this that is moving to them, that is important to them. I'll ask them a couple of questions. We'll go on to the next. Then we'll have a conversation on the panel and then open it up to you all. Okay? All right. So Shelly Oria is the editor of this extraordinarily curated book of reflections of Me Too stories. From first-person narratives to fiction to poetry, straight, gay, bi, trans, the book says what metrics cannot. In short, the pieces are perfectly polished gems, and there's more in there than is ever comfortable to relate. So she says that a couple of days after Harvey, Weinstein, she was talking about her article that she'd written with editors. And she thought it might last for a week. Tell me if I'm stealing your talk. Okay. And because this is just what she said to me. And the editor said, no, we don't want just one article. We want a book. So then they put together all the people that they knew would be interested in writing in this book. And they could have had 18. So many, 100 to 150 different voices. In the end, the book has 23. So what she said, which she thought this panel could be a success, is if there is energy and engagement and ideas among us all that actually can motivate more change. Shelly.
Thank you so much, Davia. Thank you. Hey, I haven't earned it at all. Let me earn it first. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Davia. And thank you all to all my fellow panelists for being here, and to Catherine Lasota for putting this together, and to all of you. I think, yeah, you did sort of steal part of the story there, Davia. I think that I was going to use my minutes to sort of answer a few of the questions that I've been touring with this book and doing a lot of events almost every night, and so to kind of take this time to answer the questions that seem to come up the most, and the most common one is the one that Davia just referenced, which is how did this book come about and when did it start and all of that. And so it did start right after the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke. Days after that, as Davia said, it just wasn't an article, it was a short story, because I'm predominantly a fiction writer, and writers know this, women know this. We've been writing about this shit forever, sorry for saying a bad word at Columbia, about this subject matter for a long, long time, because that subject matter is our experience, and that tends to be what our work gravitates towards, whether it's in the news or not. And so when the Harvey scandal happened, I was being honestly kind of an opportunistic writer. I assumed as a woman, because that is what I've been taught about this world, that this wasn't going to last very long. And so, because we're not usually given this platform, and if we ever do, it tends to be very brief. And so I was essentially saying, oh, everyone cares now, it's probably going to be about 5 minutes, let me get this story out there. And so I just reached out to a few editors saying, hey, would you like to publish this story? It is timely. And then this started a conversation that Davia also referenced now with Christina Kearns, who was then the executive director of McSweeney's. And Christina was saying, yes, I would love to publish this story. That is also so not enough. I've been thinking myself about this moment and what am I supposed to do as a publisher and editor in this crucial culture and moment, and what is art supposed to do? And we just started going back and forth, and this conversation pretty quickly became her saying, I want to put a book together. I don't know if we can make it happen. I don't know how fast we can do it, but that's what I want to do. And a few days after that, she said, would you be the editor? And that's really what started this whole project. An interesting thing to note is that, a calendar tells us that was 2 years ago, and this book has now been out a month. That is the nature of publishing. Again, people on this panel know, maybe some people in the audience know. That's, at least in American publishing, it's about 1.5 to 2 years. That's the cycle that it takes to put a book out, which is exactly why Indelible is one of many books coming out now, really part of this wave of Me Too books that are coming out and will continue to come out. So really this is now the publishing world kind of joining a conversation that's been going on. I'll use my time just to say a couple more things. When Christina Kearns and I started this conversation, again, this is something that Davia referenced is what was going on at that time. Of course, celebrity has power. It just so happens, I don't think it's a coincidence, that all these celebrities were also beautiful, white, mostly straight actresses. Those were the stories that we were hearing at the time, and it was forming a sort of narrative that, by the way, which is not a by the way, it's a very important point to make, that despite the fact that it was a black woman years ago in 2006, Tarana Burke, who actually started the Me Too movement, but at the moment of this globalization and it's sort of going viral and becoming what we now know to be that hashtag and to be that conversation, it was really only beautiful, white, straight celebrity actors. And so many women, myself included, most women I know, were looking at that forming narrative saying, that's peculiar, because I've had those experiences, but the media tells me I don't totally fit that. And so in the days after Harvey, when we were starting this conversation, that was one of the first things that Christina and I were talking about, is how can we curate a book that is much more inclusive in nature. And when we were putting together this list that, as Davia said at some point, did have about 150 names on it, that was one of the main things we were considering in curating the type of conversation we wanted the book to become. I think I'm going to stop here because that's probably already 5 minutes. And we'll come back. I'm happy to talk more about that later. And
Okay, so one question. How did you whittle it down?
How did what?
How did you whittle it down?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think that there's many different ways to answer this question. We had slowly put together a list of parameters that felt very important to us. So, when you say inclusivity, that's a word. But then when you break it down to, okay, how do you include as many backgrounds and experiences as you possibly can, then you sort of figure out that you need about 18 books to do what you're trying to do in one book. But then you're trying to sort of break it down almost in an Excel spreadsheet type thing. I'm just very bad with Excel, so I didn't actually have one, but I had a document that looked like it was trying to be an Excel spreadsheet. And so that was one thing. Genres that's another big thing. So you also referenced that a little bit, Davia, and I think for me, for whatever reason, we can sort of go into that or not. In literary circles, in the literary world, when the literary world responds to any timely topic, and especially if it's an anthology, it is nonfiction. It's an anthology of essays. I think there's good reason for that, and I think it is lacking. And so that was one thing that was very important for me from the start, is that we open it up, is that it be a multi-genre anthology. And so that was another big criteria, is who is writing fiction or might be open to writing fiction and poetry about this topic. Once we were looking at pieces, then we were also very much thinking of rhythm and cadence and what fits together. And we were thinking of a diversity of experiences too. So for some of them to be more grounded in the workplace, for others to be more putting a type of trauma and assault in the forefront, while others were more of a think piece that will kind of alter your mind and thinking if you let it. We wanted to have a variety stylistically as well beyond genre, and on. But those were the main considerations that kind of led us to distill the larger list to the smaller one.
Okay, so in your foreword, you talk about likening the book to helping a multi-legged creature learn how to dance.
Yes.
Great visual there.
Thank you.
But the cadence, the way you pieced together, it does move. It moves us forward.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. I believe so. I think my multi-legged creature metaphor was, in my mind, even though it does apply in the way that you're sort of talking about it, Davia, but for me it was more the collaborative, in essence, effort that is putting an anthology together. As a fiction writer, I've been very excited about collaboration and collaborative projects in the last few years since my first book came out, and I'm engaged in several of those. And to me, when this project came to the forefront in my life, I was sort of a year into this obsession with collaborations and finding collaborators and writing with other writers and that sort of thing. So I conceptualized it as another collaborative project because I was collaborating with 22 other writers who were in the book, with obviously the entire team at McSweeney's later, with the publicist that joined, and on and on and on. Later, we curated this very large tour that is going on at the moment with a lot of sort of grassroots efforts. So writers in many, many places around the country sort of volunteered to be part of events. That was another part of this collaboration. So that's the multi-legged creature that I had in mind. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. You all get to experience this creature when you read the book. So, Olatunde Johnson is the Jerome Sherman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where she teaches legislation and civil procedure, and writes about modern civil rights legislation, congressional power, and innovations to address discrimination and inequality in the United States. She clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia and for Justice John Paul Stevens of the Supreme Court. From 2001 to 2003, she served as Constitutional and Civil Rights Counsel to Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Prior to that, Professor Johnson, Olatunde, worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she conducted trial and appellate level litigation to promote racial and ethnic equity in employment, health, and higher education. She has won Columbia Law School's Prize for Excellence in Teaching and Columbia University's Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching. She graduated from Stanford and Law School and Yale University. So, Olatunde,
Yes.
over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And thanks to, I think, we're the only ones on the panel who aren't contributors to the book. So it was wonderful just to read the different pieces, and you really did a feat here, Shelly, in assembling this, and you should be commended for that. I was told I was invited as the lawyer, which usually just means like you're there to bring people down in some way,
They're having you.
So one of the areas I teach is civil rights, and I've also done a lot of work on law and social movement. So this was really interesting to me selfishly, because I am very interested in how culture and arts and other ways of building empathy, changing culture, how those influence law. In some ways, when I think about Me Too, I really think about the failure of law. So you can say, for the past 30 years, so it's 50 years since we've had the 1964 Civil Rights Act that says because of sex, you can't discriminate. That's in employment, but in other sectors, we have very similar kinds of prohibitions. And you have, at least since the late 70s, sexual harassment, hostile work environment types of prohibitions. But in some ways you get the stories that we get, at least in the workplace, because of the failure of law. And so that's very much on my mind when I think about questions of Me Too. So I guess I just want to say two things before you, ask me whatever you want to ask, or we move on to other people. One, just as a professor, as a teacher, I saw how much since the Trump election, how this has influenced my students, and then certainly the Kavanaugh hearings. They were riveted and catalyzed, I think especially by the Kavanaugh hearings, really caused a lot of students to look at the legal institutions and their failings, and also look at us and law school. I mean, just the endless things that are now on our agenda as a law school, because our women students in particular are asking very good questions about who was teaching them, how they were being taught, who was succeeding, who was getting clerkships, and what kind of a lawyer they were being trained to be. Are they just trained to sort of accept the law? Are they trained to design law and create legal change? And so that's been wonderfully revolutionary for us as an institution, and I think that a lot of institutions are asking those same questions. So when I think about it more broadly, a lot of times as lawyers, we're always telling people what you can't do. What I really see in this is lawyers partnering with social movements, with activists, and really trying to design legal changes, some of which I think could hold promise. I mean, so not much has happened on the federal level. My work is mostly in employment, and just speaking to that, not much has happened on the federal level. A lot has happened in the state and local level, in terms of trying to strengthen remedies, in terms of trying to create more transparency, because I think in some sense this is all about elevating stories, right? And so the kind of legal counterpart to that is thinking about how does information get out. So non-disclosure agreements have been a particular target. There's mandatory arbitration, which some of you may know about. But these are all the things that hide stories. So the transparency piece of it, some strengthening of remedies. All the law was on the books, but not a lot of good sanctions. The legal standards are too high, so you see sort of lowering of that at the state and local level. And I think the most promising things are the types of things that are trying to address power dynamics, because in a lot of ways, at least as to workplace issues, some of these issues are really helped by having women and people of color and others, in leadership positions. And so things like California requiring a certain number of women on the board of corporations, maybe that can play a role. I think we need to see a lot more of that. And, I have lots of questions about the limits. I have questions about who benefits, but I think some of these things are promising.
Yeah. Could you go into a little bit more detail? I mean, I read Indelible at the exact same time that I was reading She Said. Mm-hmm. It was a very powerful combination of those two books. And in She Said, they talk a lot about, and we all know about NDAs, confidentiality agreements, which allow a serial aggressor to continue, because you never know what went before, so you can't have you can't show the pattern. Now, some women in some places are saying, I may have an NDA that I have signed 10, 20 years ago, but I'm going to talk anyway. Try coming after me and see what the media storm is going to be like if I do that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about these kinds of things, when they're appropriate, when they're not, and will they ever fall?
Yeah, so I think now about 15 states have some legislation that either limits the enforceability of NDA, or I think New York and California come closest to banning NDAs. And so I actually think it's a little bit tricky of an issue. I think the best, and this is why, I think, so I'm someone who worked as a lawyer on these issues, and I know that not everyone wants disclosure, even though this is so about storytelling. Not everyone wants to tell their own story, and sometimes people want the kinds of remedies you can get through settlements. What I think in addition, so I don't think it's sufficient. I think sometimes you have to have the victim be able to control how they structure their remedy. So that's what I would say. But I do think that it reveals a whole set of other shortcomings. One is that I think that you should have to report to some sort of public agency that you have settlements and that you have non-disclosure agreements. And that way, workplaces that have a pattern of this, it either needs to be publicized or needs to be investigations. There has to be some sort of apparatus like that. I also think it reveals, I'm a public law person, but it reveals the shortcomings of the private law and governance system, because boards know about these NDAs. There's obviously a lot that the Weinstein board knew, and they don't act. And that's a dereliction of board duty, as I understand corporate governance. So I think that we can create, it's maybe abolishing NDAs is the solution, but I think that we should also think through What are the other kinds of strategies for holding institutions accountable?
So I do have to just tell you, actually, boards don't always know about the NDAs.
That's true.
I mean, I work with them, and sometimes they absolutely don't know. It's hidden from them, too. Can you talk just a minute more about unions? Mm-hmm. So unions are supposed to protect individuals from this kind of thing, yet, insofar as I know, some of the unions have some of the worst stories within their own ranks.
Yeah, you really wanted to talk about unions.
I do.
It's interesting because Davia asked me about unions, and I thought, I don't know. And I'm not sure if I know more about what I think. Okay, so yes, unions have a long history of, even though they are, all the good things we know about unions, but there's a long history of race and sex discrimination with regard to unions, and there are lots of instances in which unions don't protect and advocate for workers equally. At the same time, I think and that has to be addressed, and I actually don't know all the things that unions are doing in response to Me Too, and it's something that I would love to hear more about if people know. What I think is interesting are organizations that are really trying to link issues around economic justice with this issue around sexual harassment and justice on the basis of race and gender. And so just a quick example are that you may know that restaurant workers face a lot of sexual harassment, and the groups that advocate on behalf of restaurant workers, and they're not allowed to form a formal union, or they don't in a lot of instances, and yet some of the worker centers and the organizations that have built up around that have been very strong advocates in talking about and exposing the issue of sexual harassment, and also have linked the issue of tipped wages. And that structure which harms workers more generally to issues of sexual harassment. Same with the Domestic Workers Alliance, which represents a lot of women of color effectively. It's a very different system from a collective bargaining system, which we can get into, and it doesn't have the same power, right? But it tries to exercise power in different ways through mobilization campaigns and legislative work, and those are important for changing things at the legislative level and in institutions too.
Thank you. I mean, I guess that actually shows that there are many ways, there are many roads to Mecca here, and we can create some more. All right. So, Gabrielle Bellot. All right. Her piece in the book is a first-person narrative that is so compellingly done. You read what is written, and you read between the lines. And it gets deeper and deeper. With an MFA and a PhD in creative writing, Gabby is a staff writer and part-time editor for Literary Hub, and also works as head instructor at Catapult. She grew up in Dominica, and her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Shondaland, the Paris Review, Los Angeles Times of Books. I could go on. It's a very long list. She has been a panelist and guest lecturer at events at Penn America, NYU, Kenyon Review, etc. Formerly Brooklyn, she now lives in Queens. Her writing tends to focus on global literature, LGBTQIA identities, literary history, exile, and the Caribbean broadly, and what it means, and what it might mean, at least on the day you ask her, to navigate the world as a multiracial, transgender woman of color. Gabby?
Well, thank you all of you for coming on this very gloomy day. I know you could be somewhere else, so thank you for being here. So as Shelly sort of alluded to, we've been talking about the ways in which the Me Too movement in some ways is new and also old, and also how it applies to, in theory, everybody who's affected by it, but in practice, it's sometimes more complex who the movement seems to actually be for. So I want to sort of talk about what it means to be the right kind of woman for a movement like Me Too. And I want to start by telling some stories. Let's go back to 1921, almost a century before the Harvey Weinstein revelations, where in San Francisco, in room 1219, if I remember correctly, of a hotel, where Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, the Charlie Chaplin of his day, in terms of celebrity, he was almost better known than Chaplin himself, entered a hotel room after a young woman named Virginia Rapé walked into that room. He was hosting a party, and he told her, "Why don't you come by? I'll make you famous," essentially. A story we've all heard many times before. According to reports, he locked the door after he walked in, something that Mr. Weinstein also did on at least one occasion after following a woman into a hotel room. At some point, Virginia Rapé's bladder seems to have burst, and she claims that it was his weight on top of her, that he forced her into a position where he crushed her, and she died shortly after this. When news reports broke that she had died, women turned up in droves outside of the courthouse where Fatty Arbuckle was going to be tried. It was an amazing sight, hundreds of women turning up to protest this abuse of power. However, Mr. Arbuckle was found not guilty, in part because there was no witness alive to testify. The case has never fully been solved. There's always, to some degree, an open door when it comes to many historical cases where we don't have sufficient testimony from everybody. But in this case, the defenders of Arbuckle will often just dismiss the case out of hand. They will say, "Oh, he was a famous guy. He was a great guy. Why would he do something like that?" And Virginia Rapé was smeared in the press. She had had an abortion, supposedly, so therefore she was a terrible person. She was young. She had gone to a party. Why would she do that? Clearly, it was her fault. She did this. Reports came out that she was a prostitute. Reports came out that she was everything that could be considered, in the parlance of that day, negative. And again, there is still a bit of a mystery as to what precisely happened, but it's a good example of somebody being considered the wrong kind of woman when it comes to how the media responded to her. But there's still a difference between her story and mine. So I want to jump a few decades into 1952, when Christine Jorgensen, the Caitlyn Jenner of her day, as you will, came out as probably the most well-known trans woman of that era of American history. One of the first, not the first, but one of the first people to actually transition and become well-known. Jorgensen was initially a media darling. The media loved this idea of somebody transitioning, this idea that after the Great War, the very science that had created the atomic bomb could allow somebody to transition when it came to making your body seem like that of a cis woman's. And initially, she was beloved. But then reports began to come out that not everybody was on board with her. Some women refused to use the bathroom with her. Some women said that they didn't feel comfortable in the dressing room with her. And when reporters asked her whether or not she could have children, and they realized that transitioning didn't allow her to give birth, people began to misgender her. People began to refer to her not as her, but as he, simply because her body configuration was not the configuration that they thought a woman's body has to be. She was the wrong kind of woman, if she was even allowed to be a woman at all. Her story is a little closer to mine, but it's still not exact. I think of all the Black trans women who just this year have died. And I think of all the trans women who have died, and just in America, I should say, all the trans women who have died who we don't even know anything about them because they're not reported on, or the reports use the wrong name and the wrong gender, so we don't even know that they were trans to begin with. And I bring up all of this to question what it means to be the right kind of woman who feels comfortable sharing your stories. I felt nervous writing my piece for this anthology, not because I was revealing anything about a celebrity like Mr. Weinstein, but simply because I didn't know if I was allowed to tell this kind of story. I didn't know if I was the right kind of person to share this movement. I think I am, but then sometimes I'm not. And I don't know what that means. So, as powerful as the Me Too movement has been, and as old as this movement is, long before social media existed, there were private versions of this movement where people talked amongst each other. Despite all of this, I don't know, still, where people like me fit in. And I think that's a fundamental problem. What does it mean to be someone who's allowed to tell their story? Because when I tell my story, sometimes I'm told that I brought it on myself, not because of anything I did, but simply because I was deceiving somebody by pretending to be a woman, or by living a life that is somehow discordant with what I supposedly am. The first time I experienced harassment was with a security guard in a museum. And I was afraid to report this. I was afraid to report this man asking me to have sex with him because I thought that everybody would just think that, for one, I must have brought it on myself because I wasn't a cis woman, and therefore I was somehow at fault. And secondly, I was afraid that if he found out that I was trans, because he didn't know at first, that speaking would bring me into contact with him again, and then he would decide that I had done something bad just by existing, and just by him making that mistake, so to speak. And what would happen next if he found me and realized what I actually was? Would I have been one of those names who now refers to somebody who was just a corpse, just another name in a list of murdered women, murdered trans women specifically? I still worry about this. I still worry about ending up like one of them. And we don't fix this by fixing laws. We fix this by fixing the foundational assumptions that people have about who is at fault, who is complicit, and what it means to belong. So I absolutely love that the Me Too movement has become so powerful. But it's not a perfect movement, and I think interrogating that is very important. And that's why I think this book is absolutely essential. this collection of so many diverse voices. I have gone on far too long. Sorry, I tend to do this. I'm sure you have questions, so sorry.
Thank you. So I think we do. Let me ask you one question, and then we'll go on. But you've written about being an exile from Dominica as well, where you absolutely do not feel comfortable in your own skin, which is as you define yourself there. So that seems to be a theme that goes through, and clearly. Could you imagine a Dominica where you would feel comfortable? I mean, is that going to happen in your lifetime? What can you do to make it happen?
So I grew up in the Caribbean, specifically in a small island where, we have a prime minister who would say things like, this country will never accept same-sex marriage as long as I'm the prime minister, the kind of country where there is a task force against deviance and homosexuality. That's the name of the task force. Very, very pleasant. And I grew up believing that something was fundamentally wrong with me. I couldn't understand why I felt the way that I did. And it was on multiple levels, because I'm also, I'm attracted to multiple genders of people, and I couldn't understand what it meant to exist in my own body. I thought when I was younger that I was being tempted by a very cruel version of the devil who enjoyed playing very, very nasty games. God may not play dice, according to Einstein, but this guy did. And I tried to suppress this as long as I could, because people like me who came out were attacked, were stoned, were beaten up. I mean, if you were found out, the police could arrest you and literally examine your rectum to see if you had intercourse. Like, this actually happens. And I never felt safe. So I felt like I was in exile from the very country that I called my home, which is why I ended up eventually in New York, having decided never to return to the country that I grew up in. And, that's okay in the sense that I'm happier here. I don't know that I see a Dominica that will change soon, but maybe within my lifetime. I mean, there is such a beautiful movement of younger people in general who are empowered by social media to speak truth to power about issues like this. So I think there might be a possibility, but something foundational has to change, and that's a lot harder.
And we have to hear those voices too. Yeah, which is yours. Thank you very much. All right, our last speaker is Elissa Chappell. Let me quote to you from her latest book, not what she's written in this anthology, but her book that is called Blueprints for Building Better Girls. And by the way, Friday is the year of the girl, or the day of the girl, so I think it's a pretty appropriate quote. You ignore girls at your peril. We are complicated, dangerous creatures. There's no such thing as just a girl. Elissa is an American novelist, short story writer, editor, and essayist. Her first book of fiction, Use Me, a collection of 10 linked short stories, was published in 2000 by William Morrow, and she was a runner-up for the Penn Hemingway Award. She is the co-founder of the literary magazine Tin House and editor-at-large. She was previously a senior editor at the Paris Review. She's a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a longtime author of their Hot Type book column. Her latest book, Building a Blueprint, has been chosen as a best book of the year by the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, the Daily Beast, O Magazine. Not too shabby. She teaches at schools including Columbia, NYU, and Queens. So we're delighted to have you here. Close this out for us, will you?
No. I feel so very lucky to be here, and I basically have just been taking notes as they speak, circling things I need to think about more, and questions I want us to talk about. And I know we have a lot to talk about, so I will be brief. All that I've ever been in my whole life is a writer. I don't have any other wage earning skills, especially at this age. I've been a waiter. I've delivered balloons. I've done singing telegraph. I've done everything one could possibly do, trying not to be a writer. But it's all that I do. And when I think about those early stories that I wrote, or when I really started writing, a lot of the reason that I wrote was because I was so angry. One of the first things I remember writing is I used to write inside my closet in water swear words because one does not swear. And so much of my life, looking at those early journals, is really me venting about injustice. Injustices mostly that I have suffered as I wasn't 5 feet tall until I went to college, so I feel like I had my share of injustices, genetic injustices. So I guess what I've always been interested in as a writer and as a person are what are the stories that we all know, but we don't share, right? What is that information, that secret currency that passes between us? And so it's always been what I want to write about. And yet, while I have written about sexual assault, while I have written about different kinds of transgressions against women, I've never written anything quite like this piece. When Shelly approached me about writing a piece, I said, oh, sure, no problem. I love to write essays. And so I started writing an essay, and the issue is that I'm a really, really, really bad liar. And so I start writing the essay, and I think, well, this isn't interesting at all. This is actually really terrible, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway because this is a subject that I care a lot about. And so I turn in my essay, and a little bit of time passes, and in that time I start to feel very self-conscious. All these reports are coming out of the Me Too movement. All this stuff is happening. And then I watch Christine Blasey Ford on television. I grew up in a place where it was just kind of standard. You got kind of just knocked around, and people grabbed your boobs, and they picked you up, and people lifted up your skirt. And I lived kind of with just like a sort of, I didn't even think about it. It's just like a certain level of people feeling entitled to your body and touching you. And that's just the way that it is. And it's just a joke. Why do you take it so seriously? You wonder why I'm so angry. And so I feel like growing up that way, I'm not very easily triggered. I don't believe really in trigger warnings. And I was going to watch the hearings because, of course, you're going to watch the hearings. I watched Anita Hill. It's important. It's a moment. I want to be there. But some part of me really did not want to watch them. And I thought, well, I need to do it because I want to be there for her. And I just kept thinking, I don't want her to be alone. I don't want her to be alone. And then the first thing I wanted to do when I looked at her was I wanted to fix her glasses. I wanted someone to fix her glasses. I wanted someone to make her appear stronger than she was, to make her appear more together than she was. I wanted her to pass, basically, which was not at all what that moment was about. And as she started talking, and she started talking about the way that these guys had treated her, I thought, oh, that shit happened to me all the time. And suddenly, I was stricken. And I just started to shake, and I just sobbed, and I sat there rocking, and I thought, what am I doing? This is crazy. Like, don't do this. This is just crazy. Don't do this. And at the end of it, I thought, I can't publish that essay. That essay is a piece of shit. That essay is a total lie. Everything I wrote that I think about this is bullshit. What I need to do is I'm going to write a piece of fiction. Because honestly, if you want people to listen to them, don't yell at them. Don't scream at them. Sing at them. And I learned as a small person, if you don't want to get killed, you make the people laugh. So I figured what mattered most to me in writing this piece is I want to be read. And I don't know that I've written a story that I want more to be read than this story. And the way to get people to read it is to create a fictive universe. If I was writing nonfiction, you would say, I have absolutely nothing in common with this woman. But I'm going to stand back and I'm going to watch her life unfold here. And it will be passable theater. When you write fiction, when I create that universe and invite you in, and hopefully we share some recognizable human terrain, then the reader becomes her. The reader becomes the writer who has been raped. Once you start trying to imagine what it is that she felt, then you're that person too. And that creates empathy. And that, for me, is always the end game, right? It's not just that I want to write about what we all know about and all share. I want us to understand how it is that someone had the experience that they had. And the only way that we're going to do this, men and women, is to see what is human in each one of us, recognizably human in each one of us. I would never have written the piece were it not for Shelly. Without her, you talk about collaboration and how necessary it is that we support each other. I was just done. I had started writing this story and I had stepped away from it thinking either I'm not up to the challenge or it's not important enough, in the way that women often think our lives aren't important enough. The number of women that I meet who, when I talk to them and they tell me a story and I say, I think you should write that, and they say, oh no, it's just my story. It is utter bullshit. Years ago, I had the great fortune to interview Toni Morrison for the Paris Review. And one thing she said to me was, she said, I don't know why it is for men, it's so easy for them to call themselves writers, and it's much more difficult for women. And at the time, I was working at the Paris Review, and I had been publishing stories, writing a book column. That's how I made my money. But if you asked me what I did, I would have said I work at a magazine. I wouldn't have said I'm a writer. Like, look at my tax return. And she said, it's easy for them. If you need permission to call yourself a writer, I give you permission. At which point I started to just sob. And I thought, a lot of us need to be given permission to tell our stories because we haven't even known necessarily that they're stories that the culture needs to hear. But they are, and I feel so grateful to be a part of this book and salute you for putting it together. Thank you.
So one of the leitmotifs that is going through this conversation is self-esteem, and for who you are. And can you just talk a little bit more about this feeling of whether you are entitled to have your own story, you're entitled to tell your own story, you're entitled to be who you are, and from your perspective? Yeah.
Sure. I think when we're growing up, the books that we're reading Moby Dick, we're reading Old Man and the Sea, we're reading The Things They Carried. If we're reading any women writers, we're getting Frankenstein, although people are always kind of surprised to be reminded that, oh yeah, that was written by a woman, right? Maybe we get Beloved, maybe we get Jamaica Kincaid, but pretty much, it's pretty much all white men. And somehow we're able to imagine ourselves in those novels that these white men have written. And yet a lot of male writers would say, well, I don't read women because they're writing about stuff I don't understand. And I'm like, well, I'm a sea captain, so that's why I was down with Melville. And, I'm also Philip Roth, so I've cheated on my wife, whatever. So I think that there, when we're talking about feeling entitled to our stories or feeling like our stories need to be taken seriously, I think it's kind of felt like a privilege to be able to speak, like we've been given the floor, to speak, and that's and we take the floor. We own the floor now. You know, get your things, get your coat if you're not going to play ball. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, but it's a good title. We take the floor now.
We take
It's
the
not-
floor
it's
now,
not
get
a
your
bad-
coat.
That's
Yeah.
maybe the next
That
book.
was we
There you
own the
go.
floor now, which
It'll
is
be
We
even
own the
better.
floor now.
That's right.
I
that's right.
already went
That's
to
right.
my
No.
head as like, file away.
Reclaiming my time.
My time. Okay. All right, so let me ask you guys just one question for the panel, and then we're going to open it up to you all. How do we recover? I mean, this is a book about Me Too. This is a book about grievous harm that has been made against different kinds of people in different kinds of ways. How do victims turn into survivors? And how do aggressors, abusers, find any coming back? Is there any coming back for them? Is there any moment that, I mean, I don't know that we have seen this at all in this movement at all, but is there any way that they can find some kind of repentance and come back into the world? Because otherwise we are throwing a lot of people away.
Of course.
So this is, yeah.
There has to be some kind of reckoning. And you talk.
I mean, that is one of the toughest questions, and I certainly don't, I'm not going to pretend that, are you ready? Are you taking notes? Because I have the answer. No. Quite a day, Yom Kippur, to be asking a question about atonement, right, and forgiveness. What maybe comes to mind for me more than anything, I was thinking about that actually earlier today, is Viktor Frankl's work and book. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but he was a psychologist and philosopher, I think sort of a contemporary of Freud's, but I think he was a good 15 years younger than Freud. Man's Search for Meaning is his, I think, most well-known book. And I was thinking of him today in this context because one of the things that he's most well known for, that at least I sort of learned of his work in the context of this quote or this statement that essentially says, you know, he was a survivor, I should say, of the Holocaust, and he lost his entire family in the Holocaust, and he wrote and talked about how the one thing that can never be stripped from us, of course he said from man, but we're going to expand that, is our approach to tragedy, to trauma, to anything that befalls us. I think that can be taken out of context and has been occasionally over the years to mean it, to sort of put the onus of forgiveness on a victim or survivor in some way. And to my reading of it, that's a misinterpretation of that approach. And so on the one hand, I think how powerful is that notion that is a freedom that cannot be stripped from us, even in concentration camps, that can never be stripped from us, is what is our approach? How do we respond to trauma? There's beauty, there's power in that. And yet at the same time, the flip side of it, there's a reason why people sometimes recoil at that quote or at that approach. And I think that is exactly why we all struggle culturally with this question, because each survivor, each victim, each person should be able to write their own narrative, tell their own story, and decide as part of that, is forgiveness part of it? How does forgiveness play a part in that narrative? And so I think we are struggling to make a collective decision as a culture, as a society, because it is inherently problematic. So there's sort of a problem that is kind of that is inherent, that is part of the question we have put forth and we're trying to resolve as a culture.
No, I was just thinking about allies. Part of in the piece, I have a female editor talking to a female writer, and the female editor is not an ally. The female editor is also someone who has been sexually assaulted, which is not terribly apparent, but it's there, it's subtext. And I think sometimes some of the best feminists I know are men, and some of the best allies I know are men. So I think we have to make space for people coming back. To simply punish everyone, where do we go from there? Then you have a bunch of people who have been punished. So do they sit over here? They won't be jailed, right? So what do we do with them? We have to build in some, this might be, I don't know, what about, I guess I'd be curious to know what you think about restorative justice in this case. Is that possible? I don't know.
I mean, I think people have talked about it a lot in the context of this movement and also in law generally. I mean, I think those who want to think about alternatives to a punitive approach generally, be it in schools or around criminal justice issues, talk about restorative justice, and there's frameworks for that, some of which could be applied here. I mean, I think, I also think it's a very hard question because I think a lot of the realm of forgiveness is a private space, and you don't, in the context of Me Too, that's not what we're seeing. We're not seeing actually a discussion about that kind of private, forgiveness. We hear, we see those public relations statements that are about people being sorry, not sorry, and I just think you can't do it in that kind of space. So I have the hard time with the conversation a bit, but I do think there is a place for restorative justice. I don't know fully what it's going to look like. My problem with sort of the cutting off and the firing, so as an employment lawyer, I'm actually quite skeptical of firings as a solution to everything. And I do think that there is the sort of tendency to equate everything, everything's like lumped into the same category in a way that can be harmful, I think. So that is a real concern of mine. I think that it often then hides the problem too. So you fire someone because, they used a word they aren't supposed to use, and then you actually don't deal with the systemic problem at all, and you think that's cured it. And so that concerns me too. So it's not just that it's not a good way to solve the problem for the individual, it's also not a good way to prevent the problem and do a systemic remedy. And
there are precious few examples out there, if any, that I can't think of any really, of somebody who has transgressed in this way, in this Me Too way, and has shown true remorse, figured out a way to come back in a way that, publicly, because we know about it, so it's a public kind of humiliation, as I believe it should be, but who figured out a way to come back. And maybe that means working again with whatever his or her, and our index found 97% of these aggressors are men, so I'm just going to use him, to help others, to sort of show others, to go into the prison or to go into with the kids and show this is what it's like to be in prison, don't do it. Some way to show how you can avoid this kind of behavior. And I haven't seen it. I would be curious if anybody here has. But, one of the things I think we have to have at the other end of this is some way of atonement, yes, maybe, but also of re-entering the world with a passion to fix it in ways that we should have been fixed. I don't know.
I do want to add that I think forgiveness is complicated. Forgiveness is important to me personally. I think it's important to always try to put yourself in other people's shoes to the extent that we can. But that doesn't mean that we can just say, I forgive you, or someone on the other side can say, I'm sorry, and that's the end of it. That's just the starting point. And, when you've been attacked by somebody in some context, whatever that might be, it's difficult to see that person in the way that you saw them before this happened. There's an emotional justice too that we don't always talk about so clearly in these contexts. And that's because it's hard to re-enter the world that we lived in where we didn't expect this person to harm us, and then having to see that person again and reliving that trauma, which we do whether or not we see that person, but even more if that person is there, it's difficult. And one of the people I wrote about in my essay is an uncle of mine who began to make advances towards me. And I've never been able to think of him in the way that I did when I was younger, before I realized what he was actually trying to do. I've never been able to, as much as I like to believe that I have an open heart, I find it hard to look at him the way that I did before, because how do you hug the person who also wants to assault you? And I don't know what the answer is. And I think forgiveness is fantastic, and I think it's also very true that firing might not always be the best scenario for actually teaching people why this is wrong. But I do also think it's important that people understand that no form of harassment or abuse is okay. Yes, there are different kinds of abuse, but all abuse is just that, abuse. It doesn't matter how quote-unquote small or large it might be. The fundamental problem is that it's abuse. There are different scales of abuse, but no abuse is okay. And I think we need to make sure that that point is understood, because I have lots of friends who I talk to who don't understand this, that, you know, they say, why are you making such a big deal over this?
Carrots and sticks start to get to be a way. So let's open it up to you all now. Hopefully we haven't put you to sleep here, but yes. Hold on, they're going to have a
Wandering mic.
a mic of the wandering mic.
So on the question of forgiveness, I'm not sure that there. It's on? I'm not sure that there can be forgiveness without the transgressor seeking it, and maybe as certainly in a public sense, you know, and when a transgressor in one of these situations really transgresses against everybody, because it breaks the sort of social compact of how we are to treat one another. So that there could be a public kind of forgiveness, I just don't know how possible that is without, as with Yom Kippur, you know, you have to ask for the forgiveness. You don't just get a magical, you know, that, oh yeah.
No, I'm so not with the forgiveness.
Yeah.
See, and I didn't ask about
But-
forgiveness,
no,
by the way.
but-
You know, I asked about atonement, which is on the side of the transgressor, not on the side of the victim.
But on the side of the victim, for, in most cases, herself, it is I think, a tool for self-care, to forgive, for self-care.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
But without some kind of seeking of atonement, I don't know
I'm
how it can
curious,
happen.
when you say forgive, are you saying forgive the rapist or the assailant, or forgive yourself?
Oh, no, I mean the transgressor. No, I don't mean forgive yourself. That's, you have nothing to forgive. I mean, but I mean the transgressor has to seek it for it to be even possible. And maybe not even then, I don't know, but it can't be without.
So, you know, I just want to say that in my business, you know, one of the things that you find is when people want to come back, or when people do something wrong and there's fury in there, it's sort of inchoate anger around and coalesces against that person. What they really want to see is that that person has suffered as much as they perceive they have or they feel they have. And only when they see that that person has suffered enough then they're willing to forgive. But it's as if that there is an algorithm at a cellular level that we live with. And if you don't fit it, and if that doesn't happen, there's no public forgiveness in that public forum. And, yeah.
Also, not just that they've suffered, but that they've suffered because they realize the harm they've done.
But yeah, because
And
there's
that
the
there's
awareness.
some recognition that
Yeah.
that they've done a real bad thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that has caused them
Yeah.
suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
We have two old questions back here. I'm going to let him go first because this is the oldest point, and I have another question after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a super important question, but I guess as a social scientist, I sort of think that, obviously this is a broader social structural problem, and that while it obviously impacts both the victim and the perpetrator, the broader social structures are what everyone lives with. I mean, for instance, about 23% of the Supreme Court is made up of people that have gotten by on hearings that didn't take these sorts of concerns seriously. So I think we need to, sort of think, how do we, while we have to think about the, this question of atonement and forgiveness, I mean, it's really that there's a broader social problem. So I guess my question, as we're talking about these sorts of questions of how we move on, I mean, it has to be more structural, and what would that look like?
What would that look like?
Again, I'm going to start by saying I have no answers. I'm just a writer, just a little writer. But I have been thinking about this topic a lot and also talking about this topic a lot. I will say a few things. I mean, maybe that's sort of obvious. What needs to happen next is more legal and institutional change. But I do think that having the kinds of conversations we are having and have been having, in some ways for many years, but really in a more pronounced, focused way for the last 2 years, to me, that is huge. To me, that's at least, and that's maybe a sad belief, but I do not believe that in my lifetime it will cease to be radical. I think it will never not be radical, at least in our lifetime, maybe until the end of time, which maybe is around the same time as my lifetime, but let's not talk about the climate. So I think that's part of sort of my response to has the Me Too movement gone too far, which don't get me started on that. But the short answer is no. And also it hasn't begun to do everything that I think it can and should do. But the more elaborate answer, and to sort of try to address the question, I always see it, I've been like really having these visions of like a ladder, right? And the legal and institutional changes are the next steps on that ladder. And really the kind of the first one, the bottom one, is what we've been doing. And if that's not sturdy, we're not going to be able to climb. And so that's part of why I'm saying we need to keep having these conversations. We need to keep telling the stories. And I think when Catherine was reading earlier the stages, one of them was, I can't obviously quote it verbatim because it was the first time I heard it, and it was like, oh, they did some good work here. That kind of distills it in a pretty effective way. But one of them was about not reverting to the old way of thinking, which is so tempting, is so, in terms of our neural pathways that are used to normalizing everything that Elissa was talking about earlier. We grew up with those experiences. Our brains that is our brain configuration for most of us, is to normalize it, to make it okay, both because we were cultured to believe that, especially as women, socialized to believe that was the world that we grew up in, but also in terms of our hearts, and our bodies and our safety. It was survival, right? Just make it not have happened. Let's pretend that this didn't just happen. So for all of these reasons and more, we're so used to just pretending, to going back to the old ways of thinking, and that is one of the most sort of serious risks that I think we face right now as a culture. And the only way to face that is to continue to tell these stories, to continue, I hope that publishers will continue to publish these stories, to continue to have these conversations, again, both on a personal level, social media level, publishing level, et cetera, et cetera.
And I would just add that this conversation is a conversation we need to be having with our children. This is a conversation we need to be having with our daughters when we're talking about sex and about what consent looks like and what female sexuality looks like. And a conversation to be having with our sons about what consent looks like and about taking responsibility for yourself. And I mean, something much larger than just reading the books. We have to completely change the way that we raise our children. You know, this isn't what it means to be a man. This, you know, dominating something doesn't make you powerful. This isn't what it means to be a girl. You don't always have to roll over. You don't always have to be the sweet one. It isn't about getting along. I mean, somewhere we have to find a happy medium where we can raise our children as human beings. And I think until you start really educating them very, very young, tiny, like there is no kissing of somebody if that person doesn't want to be kissed. I remember being in the playground in Brooklyn, and this kid kept coming up and like kiss. Every time we went to the playground, this kid would come up and kiss my daughter, and the mother would say, "Isn't this so cute? They're boyfriend and girlfriend. Isn't this cute?" And I finally said to her, "No, my daughter is a lesbian. Tell your son to get his hands off her," right? And I mean, you don't want to press your child towards violence.
How old was she?
She probably was 5, 6 years old. And I was, you know, but I'm about to say, next time he comes near you, you clock him with your damn bucket, right? No means no. But not just no means no for men, no means no if you're a woman. Like, we all have to get on the same page, same playbook. I mean, for me, that's a big deal. It's just talking about this stuff much earlier and having there be real consequences from the very beginning when this stuff starts to happen.
I mean, I think clearly the child rearing part of it is super important. We think about all the ways we build in different kinds of normative assumptions about consent. One of the things I've really noticed is how school curriculums have changed and actively engage this. And I think that doesn't replace what happens at home, but it's just interesting. My 15-year-old, I mean, is very conversant in the language of consent. They've all seen the T video that, you know, and my son always tells me I'm being gender normative and assuming gender.
Yes.
And he's 12 and has been saying that since he was 8, you know, so so I think these start to change, but I wouldn't lose sight of, even though I do think that building that personal capacity is really important. I think it's also important to think about what are the structures. And I know that in law we think mostly about penalties and compliance, but that sometimes can play a role too in incentivizing more complex forms of change and pushing institutions in that direction.
Yep. One other question. You had one too?
Yeah, I will cede the floor. So.
Oh.
Well, I just wanted to add really quickly because it ties into this question of kind of systemic change, and I think the conversation has to be about our comfort levels as a human. How are we comfortable and what are we comfortable with? And I think that really isn't touched on very much, because for one person, they may be very comfortable with human contact, but another person may not be very comfortable with human contact. And so when someone is maybe boisterous and lays a hand on a shoulder, for most people that may be perfectly fine, but there may be someone who finds that very offensive to themselves because of prior history, because of prior experience, and so for them, they feel like that is assault. And so this question of where does the line of assault acceptance, like what exactly is assault? And I think it really comes down to the person, and I think we really need to talk about being accepting of how we communicate with one another. And if someone is, you know, less open to human touch, then we need to be accepting of that. We need to be open and comfortable to speak about that with one another, because I think that's not really a conversation that we have, and no one really says, well, hey, I'm not really comfortable being touched, so if you wouldn't mind. I think it becomes this really aggressive, like aggressor and aggression, when communication is lost.
Well, it's a wonderful point. I think that you know, we're all seeing, and to refer it back here, I think what we're all seeing too is that because everyone has different limits and different whatever, what is assault to one person is absolutely not assault to another. And you know, man, I wish we could at least solve the things that are assault to everybody. I mean, you know, Boko Haram kind of things that there is no question about. But we all know that amidst all of these allegations are things that are far more mild that I may look at and say, what? Really? They put a hand on your shoulder? Does that, I mean, you know, this doesn't meet my definition of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would be a little bit careful with this. I think we're talking about, there's a huge category of agreement when you look at it from the perspective of the more disempowered person or group. And I mean, I'd love to document it more empirically. I don't have the sites, but I do think we should be careful with it. I understand there are individual variations, and we should be attentive to that. I have an RA who just says, "Don't hug me," you know. That's what she says, and I was like, I'm never hugging her, you know, even on graduation day, because she's already made that clear. But that's not. You know, I think that we have to think about power when we're talking about this. And the reason the hand on the shoulder makes a difference is a context of power that someone has over you. And it's a power that we have embedded deeply in our society. It's a power that might exist in a workplace. It might be a power because of size difference. And so that's the context that makes just talking about this on the level of individual preferences, I think, is complicated.
And I do want to add to that, I mean, I see these discussions online about how we are in an age of consent culture that is somehow, in some people's minds, you know, gone too far. You know, how do I know what's okay, people ask. And it's always a bit surprising to me because in virtually every other in every other part of life, we live with some sort of unspoken contractual agreement about what consent is. You know, don't do this to me because I don't want you to do this to me. But when it comes to our bodies, then people seem to take that differently, as if consent in regards to our body is somehow different to consent in any other aspect of life. And in some ways it is, in that it's more important, but it's also not different because there's nothing radical about consent. The radical thing is that we think that consent is radical because we live in a world that is so fundamentally broken that we have to even have this discussion. So your point is very important, I think.
I'm struck by this banner, which features Charlie Rose's photograph, given his history. And what he did was publicly apologize. He said he was very sorry, and he was very embarrassed. And then he tried to capitalize on it by venturing a proposal that he would garner together all these guys who'd made this mistake, and they'd talk about it on television. And fortunately, he didn't get any takers. So I think that I don't know what you do with that photograph. But if you'll bear with me, if I might say one more thing, that Shelly referred to time and your lifetime. Well, I'm struck by how all the great thinkers, Maimonides going back hundreds of years, the Buddha going back thousands of years, have always mentioned 4 things about forgiveness. The first is acknowledgement. You have to say, I did this. The second is contrition, and I'm very sorry. The third is reparations. You have to fix it up insofar as it's possible for you to do anything about it. And the fourth is never again. And this wisdom is something that has been circulating amongst humans for thousands of years.
Thank you. Shelly.
Yeah, sure. I wanted just to add, going back to the question of what constitutes unwelcome touch, and I just wanted to add one more. A lot of what I was thinking has already been said, so I won't repeat, but one thing that feels important to me in that context is to acknowledge, at least in my experience, I would qualify, how often it is that it is cis dudes, I do believe that's the official terminology, who tend to misread these cues. So if someone how different is it for someone to touch your shoulder when you don't want that shoulder touched, but the millisecond you recoil, that other person removes the touch, versus the I'm proposing more often than not cis dude leaves his hand there, and even though you're recoiling, that cue is not being read. That goes back to some of what we were talking about, education, about parenting, about the conversation being changed. Now, I personally don't think it's miraculous that's the part of the population that keeps misreading cues or not seeing cues, or perhaps arguably sometimes seeing cues and still believing themselves entitled to that moment, to that touch, even when it is unwelcome. So I think that is an important part of that conversation to have. How can we make sure that everyone does better on that front, reading cues, reading social cues, specifically from anyone who has less power than you, to go back to the point earlier, and just seeing the person, seeing their reaction to you and responding physically in the moment when you see that. First, you have to learn to see that. Second, you have to act on it.
So I just wanted to follow up on this question of spirituality, and I see it from my vantage point as a spiritual crisis, because it's sort of like egoism at its highest and boldest and biggest, where you feel that you can act like God, that you have the right to do anything, you can, dispense the wrath, or you can abuse the person, you have the power to do whatever you want. So it's like culmination of power and control combined together, that you're exhibiting that onto someone else, and you do not see that inherent dignity that you're born with in that person. And so the way these people cannot be reformed by themselves, they have to be rehabilitated. So I think what Charlie Rose was probably suggesting was the first step of that kind of thing, to begin to have a conversation. Because, when we go into prisons and we try to reform people, there has to be a rehabilitation program. So some of these people are not going to be able to come back. They're not going to look inside and say, oh my God, I did something terrible, I'm now going to get an evolved person. They have to be helped. So what I'm suggesting is maybe there needs to be an educational program for people like this, which should all start with parenting, but when you have adults doing this, they really need to be rehabilitated in a program for them to come back to society. Thank you.
Well, you also have to get their attention. And that's what sanctions do. Whether it's firing, whether it is humiliation, whether it is becoming the butt of a movement. These are things that masters of the universe don't forget, and they can't ignore. And certainly the fear that a lot of people are expressing around this, I have to say I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I think guilt and fear sometimes play a very good role in getting people's attention so that they can do the spiritual work that's underneath that. I don't think that necessarily aggressors come to that by themselves, of themselves.
And I think these are dangerous times we live in. Like, real talk, our commander-in-chief sexually assaults women and nobody gives a shit. I'm sorry, but
yep.
So
Yeah.
So who is it, and who is it who sets the moral center and the moral code of our world? Who are those people who do?
we're talking about our lawmakers, yeah.
Yeah.
My question is actually kind of a great follow-up to that point. I, turned 20 a few months after the Harvey Weinstein scandal, and so it's been growing up in this environment. It's, both at once really exciting and really, enriching, how much is changing, and it's great. But it's also very, very easy to, turn your head and then you see the news, or you see, family members at a holiday party. And so my question is, specifically for people who are kind of coming of age in this time, how do you stay not only eager to continue participating, but how do you resist being overwhelmed? And you have to persist because you have to, but how do you kind of balance that with a sense of, being able to continue to see yourself growing and changing and not getting just beaten down by everything that feels like it's the same?
Okay, because I really want to answer this question. Because in my world, the one thing that I'm not seeing 20-year-olds necessarily get all the time right now is compassion. Compassion. And that's not just compassion for themselves, that's compassion for everyone around them. And yes, I am Buddhist, right? So I do think about this. But I think that if you don't start to have that compassion washing over you, that doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable, that doesn't mean all kinds of things, you do, but that there's a gentleness that you accord to others as well as yourself. And in some places, I mean, this is what I do for a living, a lot of this, and I see abusers turning around and abusing. I see that on college campuses. I see that in all kinds of situations. And I don't necessarily mean a rapist raping, although that certainly is true, but I mean students who some way may feel aggrieved, turning around and grievously harming somebody else, and they may be mistaken in that. And so I see that there are many different ways of that tyranny, and the only way I know how to get around that is through compassion to others. Even to your torturer. I'm not sure most of you want to go that far, but someday I'll talk to you about when the Dalai Lama actually told me that. So I do actually think that's where we have to go.
Was your question at all about how do you keep putting one foot in front of the other when there's so much bad stuff?
Yeah, how do you keep like fighting the fight without feeling overwhelmed every single morning?
I could maybe answer the second part of that question. I think choose your battles, figure out what it is that you feel most passionately about, and that's where you put your energies, because unfortunately you can't be everywhere, right? We all need to care about everything, but you simply can't be everywhere. And I think it's important to think of your community. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for, reproductive equality. This is what we do. This is what we do. This is where we put our energy and our time. And when one of you gets exhausted, somebody else steps up. And when you're exhausted, recognize that and practice some self-care. Be like, you know what? I'm really in a difficult place right now. I need to step back. I'm not leaving the movement, or maybe it's the environment, maybe it's incarceration justice. Just to be able to give yourself space to step back. It doesn't make you a bad activist. It makes you a human being, and be prepared to step in for somebody when they need to be spelled too. But you can't do everything. So choose what it is that you care most about and direct your energy there. Or that would be my suggestion.
And I want to add to you, as somebody who has also, to some degree, come of age during this, you need to remember that your stories matter. It doesn't matter how much of a celebrity or how much of an ordinary person you imagine yourself to be. Your story matters, and telling your story can really help somebody in ways you would never imagine. Somebody across the world might read something that you write and think for the first time, wow, this is somebody like me. I am a person who sometimes speaks to my students in my nonfiction courses about whether or not their stories matter. And of course their stories matter. But my students sometimes think, well, I'm just an ordinary person who wants to read about me. And even if something traumatic happened to them, they think, well, why would anybody care? And they brush it aside. But the point of this movement at its best is to let us realize that all of our stories matter, and there is nothing for us to brush aside. So always remember that your story matters. You know, I think what Elissa said is absolutely important. You have to practice self-care. But a part of that is remembering that you are a part of this too. So don't ever let anybody tell you that your story is somehow lesser than anybody else's.
And just to add to these themes, so I was a civil rights lawyer and always was confronting this question of how do you feel like you're making a difference? And I think part of it is about being humble about the amount of change you can make in your lifetime, right? But there is real change, and I saw that kind of progress every day on the issues that I worked on. But what I was also going to say that sort of connects to this notion of telling your story is that I'm actually at the point where I tell my students, I'm not dispensing advice anymore. Like, it's your turn. And you're going to do things differently. You're going to learn from our mistakes. I think civil rights lawyers weren't very good about connecting to social movements often. And now the new generation of people who think about race equity and gender equity are much better at building a base, for instance, just to use that example. You are going to feel an urgency about certain issues that for us, we're going to be like, oh yeah, you don't remember how bad it was, so it's fine. Like, you're saying, no, it's terrible. And you need that urgency, right? And so I'm happy. I mean, I'm still going to do my work, right? And try to make this world a better place, but I'm really happy to pass the baton to people who have an urgency about it and actually have a new set of strategies, because I think we need that.
I'm just going to say real quick, I think there's a meeting point between all of these points, because the more you think about and let that sink in, that someone is passing the baton to you, that there is so much that you can do, that your story matters, the more you start stressing out about all those things. And that's when picking your battles comes in. That's when self-care and compassion comes in. Compassion just for yourself on those days where you can't do it, and on those battles that you did not pick.
So it's 8 o'clock, and I think that some of us could continue to stay here if you'd like, but in deference to everyone else who might want dinner or something like that, we'll adjourn. We want to thank you so much for this.